What would you do if you were humiliated in front of dozens of people, simply because of the way you looked? You're being humiliated, degraded, treated like trash, all because they think you don't belong. But what if the person they're tormenting isn't just a nobody? What if she's the one who owns the entire airline? In the next few minutes, you'll witness a brutal act of cruelty, a shocking twist, and a revelation so devastating it will haunt everyone who dared to laugh. Brace yourself. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Mia Sanders stepped onto the plush carpeted aisle of the first-class cabin, her modest floral dress starkly contrasting with the sleek tailored suits and designer handbags around her. Heads turned, eyebrows raised, subtle scoffs, barely concealed behind perfectly manicured hands. Mia's steps faltered slightly, but she straightened her back, forcing herself to walk steadily to her seat. A stewardess, blonde and impeccably dressed, intercepted her halfway down the aisle. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you lost?" the stewardess asked, her voice drenched in feigned politeness, but her eyes openly critical. Mia smiled faintly, shaking her head as she held up her boarding pass. The stewardess glanced at it, disbelief flickering in her eyes, before a forced smile stretched across her lips. "Right this way," she said, guiding Mia with stiff, rehearsed movements. As they approached Mia's assigned seat, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit eyed her up and down, whispering something to his companion, who stifled a laugh. "Unbelievable. They're letting anyone in here these days," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Mia's cheeks flushed, but she kept her head high, settling into her seat by the window. The stewardess lingered, as if unsure whether to actually allow her to stay. A woman, a few rows ahead, glanced back, eyes narrowed, phone discreetly aimed in Mia's direction, as if documenting some scandalous breach of protocol. The man beside Mia scoffed audibly, pulling his laptop closer, as if her presence might somehow taint his productivity. Mia placed her small, worn leather handbag on her lap, smoothing the fabric nervously, her hands trembling, despite her best efforts to appear calm. The stewardess finally walked away, muttering under her breath, and Mia exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the clouds gathering outside. The whispers continued, each sneer cutting deeper than the last. Someone behind her laughed outright, murmuring something about charity cases sneaking into first class. Mia kept her gaze forward, her jaw clenched, heart pounding, as the weight of judgment pressed down on her. She could feel every disapproving stare, every dismissive shake of the head. The plane filled, and as the final call for boarding rang through the speakers, Mia shut her eyes, willing herself to disappear. She wasn't here to cause trouble, just to travel like everyone else. But it was clear she didn't fit into their carefully curated world of luxury. As the engines hummed to life and the cabin lights dimmed, Mia could only hope the flight would be quiet, that somehow she could just melt into the seat and endure the silent, searing disdain until they reached their destination. The plane taxied down the runway, and as the engines roared, the whispers grew louder. The businessman next to Mia leaned back, eyes fixed on her, with thinly veiled contempt. "You know," he said to his colleague across the aisle, "first class used to mean something. Now they're letting anyone in." His voice carried deliberate, every syllable dripping with disdain. Mia stared straight ahead, her jaw tightening, hands gripping the armrests as the plane ascended. The stewardess Emily began making her rounds, her smile bright and plastic, as she handed out complimentary champagne flutes to the well-dressed passengers. When she reached Mia, her eyes flicked over the woman's simple dress and scuffed shoes. Emily's smile evaporated, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. "We're out of drinks," she said curtly, moving on without a second glance. The businessman chuckled, clinking his glass with his colleague. "Guess even the freebies aren't for everyone," he said, raising his glass pointedly. Mia swallowed hard, her throat tight, forcing herself to stare out the window as the clouds rolled by. A young woman 2 rows ahead angled her phone over her shoulder, pretending to take a selfie, but clearly capturing Mia in the frame. "I mean, come on," she whispered to her friend, loud enough for Mia to hear. "Who let that thrift store reject in here?" The friend snorted, scrolling through her phone, fingers flying over the screen. Maybe she won a contest, or snuck in. More laughter, sharp and cruel, echoing down the aisle. Mia's cheeks burned as her gaze dropped to her lap, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Across the aisle, a teenage boy nudged his mother, nodding toward Mia. "Mom, is she supposed to be here?" he asked, his voice, innocent eyes wide. The mother glanced over, her lips curving into a sneer. "No, honey, some people just don't know their place." Emily walked by again, her tray, now empty, eyes landing on Mia with a smirk. "Ma'am," she said, voice artificially sweet. "Are you sure you're in the right seat? Coach is back there." Mia opened her mouth to respond, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. The words tangled with the knot of shame tightening in her chest. Emily leaned in closer, eyes gleaming. "Or did you just wander up here hoping for some free champagne?" she whispered, her breath warm and taunting. The businessman beside Mia snickered, nudging his colleague. "Maybe we should start a GoFundMe for her," he said loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. The words hung heavy in the air, each one like a slap to Mia's face. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry, refused to give them the satisfaction. She straightened her spine, forcing herself to breathe, to hold it together. But as the plane continued its ascent, the whispers and laughter only grew louder, each comment a knife twisting deeper, each glance a blow that left invisible bruises on her already breaking heart. The plane leveled off and the cabin lights dimmed, but the tension around Mia only intensified. Emily returned her heels, clicking sharply against the carpet as she marched straight to Mia's seat. "Ma'am," she said, her voice raised just enough to draw the attention of every passenger nearby, "I need to see your ticket again." Mia's stomach clenched as she fumbled to retrieve the crumpled boarding pass from her handbag, her fingers trembling. Emily snatched it away, her lips curling into a smug, condescending smirk as she scanned it, holding it up as if it were evidence in a trial. "I knew it," Emily said, voice dripping with triumph. "This ticket is clearly a fake. There's no way someone like you could afford a first-class seat." A ripple of gasps spread through the cabin, eyes darting from Mia to Emily, then back to Mia again. Mia's heart hammered in her chest, her cheeks burning under the relentless gaze of strangers. "What a scammer," a woman behind her muttered, and her husband chuckled, shaking his head. "Probably sneaked in from Coach," the businessman beside Mia said, leaning back with a satisfied smirk. "Pathetic." Emily crossed her arms, her eyes cold and gleeful. "Stand up," she demanded, voice sharp and commanding. "You're holding up the rest of the passengers who actually belong here." Mia's breath hitched, her legs unsteady as she rose from her seat, clutching her handbag against her chest like a lifeline. The cabin fell silent, every set of eyes trained on her, as if she were a criminal caught in the act. Phones appeared, cameras, angled fingers, tapping record, as passengers began filming the unfolding humiliation. "World's worst gold digger," a teenage girl sneered, her phone raised high. "Look at her face. She knows she's been caught." Mia's knees wobbled, her vision blurring as Emily grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the aisle. "Let me guess," Emily said, voice loud and mocking. "You thought you could fake your way into first class and no one would notice. You thought you could trick us all." Mia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. A lump the size of a boulder lodged in her throat, suffocating her. "Throw her out!" someone yelled from behind, and another passenger laughed. "Better check her bag. She probably stole something too." The laughter grew, rising like a tidal wave, crashing over Mia as Emily shoved her toward the exit. The businessman shook his head, raising his glass to his colleague. "People like her don't know when they're beaten," he said, smirking. "It's almost sad." Mia's eyes stung, tears pooling, but refusing to fall, as Emily shoved her into the aisle, every step a blow, every stare a knife slicing through her skin. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of her public disgrace, every ounce of her shattered dignity, as she stood alone in the aisle, the whole world watching, judging, sneering. And she couldn't do a thing to stop it. Before Mia could take another step, a commanding voice echoed through the cabin, slicing through the cacophony of sneers and whispers like a blade. "What on earth is going on here?" The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and Lucas Herring strode down the aisle, his powerful presence impossible to ignore. His tailored suit gleamed under the cabin lights, his eyes cold as ice as they locked onto Emily. Emily's face went ghostly white, her hand dropping from Mia's arm, as if it had been burned. Mr. Herring," she stammered, her bravado evaporating in an instant. "I was just... This woman, she doesn't belong here. Doesn't belong..." Lucas's voice dropped to a dangerously low register, and every passenger leaned in closer, their faces a mixture of confusion and dread. "You're absolutely right," he said, eyes narrowing as he glanced around the cabin. "None of you belong in the presence of this woman." Murmurs erupted, heads swiveling between Mia and Lucas, trying to make sense of the scene. Emily's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her carefully constructed mask of confidence shattering. But she's a fraud. I checked her ticket. It's a fake. Emily's voice trembled and sweat beaded at her temple as Lucas took a deliberate step closer. A fraud, he said, his jaw tightening. You mean the owner of this entire airline? The air sucked out of the room as gasps ricocheted down the aisle. The businessman beside Mia choked on his drink, his eyes bulging. The teenage girl with the phone dropped her device, her jaw hanging open. What Emily whispered, her knees buckling as she stumbled back a step. Lucas's expression hardened as he yanked a sleek leather folder from inside his suit jacket, snapping it open with a flick of his wrist. Inside, a document gleamed under the cabin lights. A transfer of ownership signed, sealed, and stamped with Mia Sanders' name, printed in bold, unmistakable letters. Meet Mia Sanders. Lucas announced, his voice booming across the cabin. The new majority shareholder of this airline and every single plane in its fleet. The silence was deafening. A pin could have dropped, and it would have echoed like a gunshot. Mia stood frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears, as every pair of eyes in the room fell on her. Their gazes transformed from contempt to utter disbelief. The businessman swallowed hard, his face ashen. You mean, she owns every inch of this plane, Lucas said, turning to face Emily, who now shook violently, her face contorted in terror. And you just dragged her out of her seat, humiliated her in front of dozens of witnesses, and falsely accused her of being a criminal. Emily's lips quivered, her eyes darting around, desperate for an escape. I didn't know, she croaked, tears pooling as her legs gave way. I swear I didn't know. Ignorance is not an excuse. Lucas snapped, his voice like a whip crack, especially when you enjoyed every second of it. He turned to Mia, his expression softening just a fraction. Mia, would you like to press charges? Mia swallowed, her throat raw, her heart pounding as she scanned the sea of faces, each one now desperate, panicked, pleading for mercy. Emily dropped to her knees, her palms pressed together as if in prayer. Please, she sobbed, mascara running down her cheeks. I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Mia's eyes met Emily's, and in that moment, the power shifted like a tectonic plate snapping into place. The woman who had once been invisible, insignificant, unworthy of even basic respect, now held the fate of her tormentors in the palm of her hand, and for the first time in her life, they all knew it. Before Mia could respond, the tension shattered like glass as another voice echoed through the cabin, a low, gravelly voice filled with authority and familiarity. Mia. Heads swiveled, necks craned, and gasps filled the air as a man stepped forward from the private suite at the front of the plane. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his salt and pepper hair slicked back, his dark eyes locked onto Mia with a mixture of relief and pride. It was Richard Sanders, the elusive CEO and the true owner of the entire airline conglomerate. Mia's father. The crowd erupted into stunned whispers. That's Richard Sanders, someone gasped. The man who controls half the aviation industry. Emily's mouth fell open, her eyes darting between Mia and Richard as if she'd just seen a ghost. Richard strode down the aisle, his imposing frame blocking out the overhead lights as he approached his daughter. Mia's lips parted, her eyes wide, her heart hammering in her chest, as he reached out and cupped her face with his massive hands. I'm sorry, Mia, he said, his voice a gravelly murmur, just loud enough for her to hear. I thought you were ready. I wanted to see how they'd treat you. Tears stung Mia's eyes, and she swallowed hard, her throat raw, unable to speak. Richard straightened his gaze, sweeping across the cabin, his jaw clenched like a vice. You all think you can judge my daughter? He thundered, his voice booming, rattling the glassware. You dare to humiliate her because she's dressed simply, because she doesn't flaunt her wealth like the rest of you. His glare zeroed in on the businessman, who cowered back into his seat, his face pale, his knuckles white as he clutched the armrests. You, Richard growled, pointing a thick finger at the man. You called her a charity case. Do you have any idea how much she's worth? The businessman shook his head, sweat beading at his temple as he stammered. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to. Richard's eyes blazed, his voice rising to a roar. My daughter owns the wings of the plane you're sitting on. She owns the airspace you're flying through. She could buy and sell every last one of you without blinking. The businessman whimpered, eyes darting to Mia, desperate pleading. Mia remained silent, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on a spot just above his head. Richard turned his wrath onto Emily, who was now sobbing openly, her mascara-streaked face a mask of terror. "And you!" he snarled, stepping closer, towering over her. "You had the audacity to drag my daughter down this aisle, to humiliate her, to treat her like a thief. My daughter, your employer." Emily collapsed to her knees, clutching at Richard's pant leg, her tears staining the fabric as she choked out, "Please, forgive me. I didn't know. Please, mister." "Sanders!" Richard yanked his leg away, his eyes cold and merciless. "You think I care about your apologies? You think groveling will erase what you did?" He turned to Lucas, his voice dropping to a menacing rumble. "Get her off my plane, now." Lucas nodded, snapping his fingers, and 2 security guards appeared as if from nowhere, each grabbing one of Emily's arms as she screamed and thrashed her nails, clawing at the carpet as they dragged her down the aisle. "No, please, I'll lose everything. Please, I'm sorry, Mia. Please, I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't mean it." Her shrieks echoed down the corridor until the doors closed behind her, and then there was only silence. The kind of heavy, suffocating silence that wrapped around every passenger like a noose. Richard exhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling as he collected himself. Then he turned back to Mia, his gaze softening, his hands gentle as they cupped her face once more. "You okay?" Princess Mia nodded, but her jaw clenched and her eyes shone with unshed tears. "I don't care about the money, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to be treated like a human being." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he might shatter. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, his chin resting atop her head as he whispered, "They're going to pay for every tear they made you shed. Every single one." And as he held her, the rest of the passengers sat frozen in their seats, each of them silently wondering if they would be the next to pay. Richard released Mia and stepped back, his eyes now cold as ice as they scanned the cabin. "You," he said, pointing at the businessman who had laughed the loudest. The man flinched, his face draining of color beads of sweat forming along his brow. "Stand up, Richard," commanded, his voice a blade slicing through the air. The businessman stumbled to his feet, his knees shaking, his expensive watch glinting under the cabin lights as he wrung his hands nervously. "Do you know how many times I've flown on this airline?" Richard asked, his tone deceptively calm. "Do you know how much money I've spent building a first-class experience for people like you?" The man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to." Richard's eyes blazed and the businessman shrank back. "You called my daughter a charity case. You laughed at her. You encouraged the whole cabin to humiliate her. You mocked her like she was less than nothing." The businessman's lower lip quivered and his eyes darted to Mia, who now stood tall, her eyes locked onto him with a newfound strength. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't care," Richard snapped. "People like you think you're better than everyone else because you have money. You think wealth makes you powerful. You think it gives you the right to degrade someone just because they don't dress like you." The man's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Richard's glare was relentless, his voice echoing through the silent cabin. "You're banned from every flight in my airline, effective immediately. Your company blacklisted, your family blacklisted. Your accounts frozen until we've audited every single transaction. You thought you were untouchable. Think again." The man's knees buckled and he collapsed back into his seat, his head hanging low as passengers nearby edged away as if his misfortune was contagious. Richard's eyes moved to the teenage girl and her friend, both of whom had filmed Mia's humiliation with glee. "Hand over your phones," he ordered, voice as sharp as a whip. The girls exchanged panicked glances, their hands trembling as they passed their phones to Lucas. "Delete every video, every photo," Richard said, his gaze drilling into them. "If I find one clip of my daughter's humiliation circulating online, I will sue you for every penny you and your parents will ever make." "Understood." The girls nodded frantically, tears streaming down their faces as Lucas methodically erased the footage, their hands clutching each other as if holding on for dear life. The rest of the passengers watched, eyes wide, breaths held, terrified to even blink. Richard stepped forward, his boots echoing against the carpet, his shadow falling over each and every one of them. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You don't get to judge someone based on their clothes, their looks, or your assumptions. You don't get to decide who's worthy and who's not. His gaze swept over them, a predator surveying prey. From this moment forward, anyone caught treating another passenger the way you treated my daughter will face the same fate as that stewardess. You will be removed, banned, and held accountable. No exceptions, no mercy. The passengers cowered, their eyes fixed on their laps, their bodies rigid with fear. Richard turned back to Mia, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. "Are you ready to take your seat, Miss Sanders?" Mia nodded, her chin held high, her shoulders back as she walked down the aisle, every step heavy with newfound power. As she sank into her seat, Richard leaned down, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You okay?" he whispered, his voice a gentle rumble. "I am now." Mia said, her gaze sweeping over the cabin, over every head bowed in shame, every face flushed with humiliation. "I am now." And as the plane soared higher into the clouds, the passengers sat in a silence that screamed louder than any words ever could. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, the atmosphere remained suffocatingly tense. Heads remained bowed, eyes glued to the floor, and no one dared to speak. The echoes of Richard's wrath still vibrated through the cabin, like the distant rumble of thunder. Mia sat upright, her back straight, her gaze steady as she looked ahead, her expression calm but unyielding. Across the aisle, Grace, the young flight attendant who had quietly slipped Mia a glass of water earlier, fidgeted nervously, her eyes darting to where Lucas now stood beside Richard. Lucas leaned down, murmuring something to Richard, who nodded before straightening to his full, imposing height. "Grace," Richard said, his voice firm but not unkind. Grace's head snapped up, her eyes wide as she swallowed, her hands clasped tightly together. "Yes, sir. You showed my daughter kindness when no one else did." Richard said, his expression softening just a fraction. "You treated her with respect without knowing who she was. That speaks volumes about your character." Grace's eyes welled up with tears, her lower lip trembling as the weight of his words sank in. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Richard stepped forward, extending a hand toward Lucas, who handed him a sleek black folder embossed with the airline's golden logo. Richard opened it, pulling out a certificate and holding it up for all to see. "Effective immediately, you are promoted to head of cabin crew," Richard announced, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. Gasps echoed down the aisle, and Grace's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Me," she stammered, her breath hitching as her colleagues looked on, some with envy, others with grudging respect. But nothing," Richard said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You earned this. Congratulations." Grace's face crumpled as tears spilled down her cheeks, and Mia smiled softly, nodding at her in encouragement. Grace stepped forward, her hands shaking as she accepted the certificate, her voice cracking as she said, "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression warm, almost fatherly. "Keep being the kind of person who sees the heart, not the clothes," he said. "That's the kind of person who deserves to fly high." Grace nodded, wiping her tears as she stepped back, clutching the certificate to her chest like a lifeline. The cabin remained silent, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Richard's eyes swept the cabin once more, his gaze settling on an elderly man seated at the very back. The man wore a worn-out coat, his hands gnarled with age, his eyes kind but tired. He was the only one who had spoken up for Mia, quietly but firmly, when everyone else had joined in the mockery. Sir Richard said, his voice gentler now. "Would you mind joining us in the private suite for the rest of the flight?" The old man's eyes widened, his head shaking as he stammered. "Oh no, sir. I couldn't. I didn't do anything to deserve." "You did everything," Mia said, her voice carrying clearly and strongly. "You showed me compassion when everyone else showed me cruelty. That's more than enough." The old man's lip quivered, and as Lucas and Grace helped him to his feet, the rest of the passengers averted their eyes, each of them burning with shame, each of them drowning in the weight of what they had done, or failed to do. Richard led the old man down the aisle, his arm around his frail shoulders, guiding him toward the suite, where the plushest seats awaited. Mia watched them go, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. As Grace resumed her duties, her shoulders squared with newfound confidence, the passengers remained frozen, each of them grappling with their own reflection, each of them haunted by the memory of Mia's humiliation and the realization that they could have been heroes but had chosen to be villains instead. And now, as the plane soared higher, each of them sat in silence, staring out the window, trying to forget what they had done. But Mia's face was seared into their memories, a constant haunting reminder that they would never be able to escape. Not now. Not ever. Mia stood at the front of the cabin, her posture regal, her eyes blazing with a fire that dared anyone to look away. The passengers' eyes were glued to her, now the very same people who had laughed, sneered, and humiliated her just hours ago. Now they couldn't bear to meet her gaze, their faces downcast, their hands wringing nervously in their laps. Mia took a slow, steady breath, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of their collective shame hang heavy in the air like a storm cloud about to burst. "You know," she began, her voice calm but sharp, slicing through the silence like a knife. "When I boarded this plane, none of you saw me. You saw my clothes. You saw my shoes. You saw what you thought was a nobody." The businessman who had mocked her flinched, his jaw clenching as sweat beaded at his temple. The teenage girl who had filmed her humiliation stared at the floor, biting her lip until it bled. "You saw what you wanted to see." Mia continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, pausing on each guilty face. "You didn't see me. You didn't see a human being. You didn't see a person with feelings, with a name, with a life." Her words hit like punches, each one landing with a thud, each one making the passengers squirm deeper into their seats. "You saw a charity case. You saw a scammer. You saw someone who didn't belong. And why? Because I wasn't wearing a designer dress, because my shoes weren't expensive enough, because I didn't look like you." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the shame thick and suffocating, rising like a tidal wave. Mia's jaw clenched and her hands tightened into fists at her sides. "You thought I was nothing," she said, her voice rising, her eyes blazing with unshed tears. "You thought you could degrade me, humiliate me, throw me around like garbage. And it would be okay, because in your eyes, I was less than you." Emily's empty seat sat at the back, a glaring reminder of what happens when cruelty is unchecked, when power is abused, when people forget that wealth doesn't make you better. It just makes you louder. "You called me names," Mia said, her voice breaking, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "You laughed at me. You took videos of my humiliation and called it entertainment. You destroyed me without a second thought. And why? Because I wasn't dressed like you? Because I didn't have a designer bag? Because you thought I was beneath you?" Mia's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, her eyes glistening as she looked around the cabin, each passenger now shrinking beneath her gaze. "But here's the thing," Mia said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I am not what I wear. I am not my clothes. I am not my shoes. And neither is anyone else." The businessman shifted uncomfortably, his face ashen, his hands shaking as he wiped his brow with a trembling hand. The teenage girl sniffled, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as her phone lay forgotten in her lap. "I am not what you thought I was," Mia said, her eyes locked onto each and every one of them. "I am more. And so is every single person you dismiss. You humiliate, you degrade just because they don't look like you." Mia's voice wavered, but she held her ground, standing tall, standing strong. "You judge me without knowing me. You saw a girl in a cheap dress and decided she was worthless. But the truth is, you're the ones who are bankrupt." A heavy silence fell over the cabin, the air thick and suffocating, the passengers drowning in the weight of Mia's words, in the weight of their own guilt. "So, the next time you look at someone and think they're nothing," Mia said, her voice a razor blade cutting through the air, "remember this moment. Remember how wrong you were. And remember that the only thing that truly defines a person isn't what they wear. It's how they treat others." Mia's eyes blazed and her chest heaved as she took one final shuddering breath. Because in the end, the only thing that matters isn't the label on your clothes or the brand of your shoes. It's the heart that beats beneath them. And with that, Mia stepped back, her head held high, her eyes fierce and unflinching, as the passengers sat in silence, drowning in the echoes of her words, knowing they would never forget the woman they had tried to crush, and the lesson she had taught them in return. The plane touched down, and the heavy silence hung over the cabin like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. As the wheels screeched against the tarmac, the passengers remained frozen in their seats, eyes averted, breaths shallow, each of them reliving the shame that had unraveled in the skies. The seatbelt sign flicked off, and Mia rose slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate, her gaze fixed straight ahead as she collected her modest handbag and slung it over her shoulder. Richard stood beside her, his imposing presence a protective shield, his eyes scanning the cabin like a hawk circling prey. The businessman who had taunted her cowered in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests, as if they might anchor him to some shred of dignity. The teenage girl and her friend who had filmed Mia's humiliation sat hunched over their shoulders, trembling eyes red, rimmed their phones now shoved deep into their pockets like evidence of a crime. Mia took a step forward and the sea of passengers parted heads, bowing faces flushing with humiliation as she walked down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Grace, the newly promoted head of cabin crew, stood at the exit door, her eyes shining with pride and respect. As Mia approached, Grace straightened her spine, her chin lifting. "Thank you, Miss Sanders," Grace said, her voice strong, her eyes glistening. "For everything." Mia paused, her eyes softening as she reached out and clasped Grace's hand. "You deserve that promotion." Mia said, her voice gentle but firm. "Never forget who you are, no matter what anyone says." Grace nodded, her lower lip quivering, and Mia squeezed her hand before releasing it and stepping into the jet bridge. The elderly man who had defended her stood at the end of the bridge leaning on his cane, his eyes moist as he looked up at Mia with a gentle, trembling smile. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Real good." Mia's throat tightened and she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around the old man in a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." The old man patted her back, his hands gnarled but strong, his voice cracking as he said, "Sometimes the only way to change the world is to show them their own reflection." Mia pulled back, wiping a tear from her cheek, and nodded. "You're right," she said, her voice firmer, now stronger. "And today, they saw exactly who they are." The old man's smile widened, and he patted her hand one last time before shuffling away, his shoulders lighter, his steps steadier. Mia watched him go, her heart full, her spirit unbroken. Outside, the sun hung low in the sky, casting the runway in a golden glow. Richard stepped up beside Mia, his expression soft, his eyes filled with pride. "You ready to go home?" he asked, his voice gentle, his hand reaching out to take hers. Mia slipped her hand into his, and together they walked down the tarmac, the wind whipping through her hair, the world stretched out before them like an endless sky. And as they climbed into the black limousine, the door closing with a soft click, Mia glanced back at the plane behind them, her eyes narrowed, her chin lifted. Inside the plane, the passengers remained seated, each of them staring at their reflections in the small square windows, each of them seeing not just their faces, but the ugliness they had exposed. And as the plane taxied away, their haunted eyes remained fixed on the tarmac, where the woman they had tried to crush now soared higher than they could ever reach. The black limousine rolled smoothly down the highway, city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white as Mia leaned back against the cool leather seat, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The air inside was thick with unspoken words, with echoes of everything that had just transpired. Richard sat beside her, his hands folded, his jaw tight, his eyes staring straight ahead, as if he could still see the faces of every passenger who had looked at Mia like she was nothing. Mia's phone vibrated in her lap, and she glanced down, her eyes narrowing as the screen lit up with dozens of notifications. Videos of her public humiliation had already gone viral, hashtags, trending comments pouring in like a storm surge. Some defended her outrage at the cruelty she'd endured. Others sneered, called her a liar, a manipulator, a spoiled heiress who staged the whole thing for attention. Mia's grip tightened on the phone, her knuckles white, her pulse pounding in her ears as she scrolled through the comments. Who does she think she is? Just because she's rich doesn't mean she deserves respect. I bet she planned this whole thing to make herself look like a victim. Another spoiled princess pretending to be poor. Disgusting. The words blurred together, each one a knife twisting deeper, each one a reminder that even after everything, people still chose to see what they wanted. Richard reached over, his hand warm and solid as it closed over hers. "Turn it off," he said, his voice a low, steady command. "Don't let them steal another second of your peace." Mia's jaw clenched and she swallowed hard, blinking back the sting of tears as she pressed the power button, the screen going dark. "How do they not see?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "How do they still not see?" Richard's face softened and he pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders, holding her tight, as if he could shield her from the world. "Some people will always choose to see the worst in you," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "But that doesn't make it true." Mia leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, his heartbeat a steady grounding rhythm beneath her cheek. I tried to make them see that I'm more than just clothes, more than just money, she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. But it didn't matter. They still looked at me like I was nothing. Richard's hand stroked her hair, his eyes dark and fierce as he said, "They saw you." They just couldn't handle what they saw. A woman who was stronger, kinder, better than they could ever be. Mia closed her eyes, her breath shuddering out in a broken exhale as the car continued to roll down the endless road, the city lights growing fainter behind them. Outside the window, a billboard loomed, its message simple but powerful. Be kind. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Mia's eyes locked onto the words, her chest tightening as the message sank in, echoing through her mind, resonating with every beat of her heart. She sat up, her eyes blazing, her back straight as steel. "Dad," she said, her voice firm and clear. "I don't want to hide anymore. I want to use my voice. I want to make them see." Richard's brows lifted, his eyes searching hers, and then he nodded a slow, approving nod, his lips curving into a small, proud smile. "Then, show them," he said, his hand squeezing hers. "Show them exactly who you are." Mia's eyes flashed, her chin, lifting, her heart pounding with a new kind of resolve. A resolve that burned hotter, fiercer than anything she'd ever felt. The world had tried to break her, to crush her, to silence her. But she wasn't broken, she wasn't crushed, and she would never be silenced. As the limousine disappeared into the night, Mia Sanders, the girl they had once called a nobody, was ready to show the world that she was everything. And this time, they would see her. They would see her, and they would never forget her. Not ever. The plane has landed, but the echoes of Mia's humiliation still linger like a storm cloud that refuses to clear. They thought she was nothing. They called her names, laughed in her face, and dragged her through hell. But now, as they sit in the silence, haunted by the truth they never saw coming, one question remains: what will they do when the world finds out? Because some wounds can't be erased, some scars can't be forgotten, and some people, no matter how rich or poor, will never forgive.